Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Open Source Days Playback and Review Working Group. I am Eric Strauss. I am your moderator. See if I can get. Oops, we're going a little fast here. So that's me. I'm Eric Strauss. I'm your moderator today. A couple of housekeeping bits. We have two presentations today from two different speakers, and they're on slightly different topics. So we'll do Q&A at the end as a combined session, but please feel free to type any questions you might have during the sessions, either one of those presentations, in the chat, and I'll moderate the chat at the Q&A at the end. So the first thing we want to talk about is sort of what are we talking about here? Why are we here today? One of the big challenges that we face in the sort of medium review space is this iterative cycle of a combination of artist revision, supervisor review, and production status. These three things combine to make sort of a rich and comprehensive experience for a production to be able to execute on the type of review strategies that are most common in visual effects and animation. And it's not so much a workflow challenge as it is also sort of a media and metadata challenge. And so our working group was formed around trying to think about what this space is, how it works, what makes a competent exercise of both a workflow and a system that makes review successful, and what can we as an open source community do about improving that situation for our overall industry around visual effects animation and the overall sort of entertainment industry at large. So one of the challenges that we have is we have lots of apps, and here's a bunch of commercial products that do a whole bunch of things really well, but we have very few standards, and very few of these things are integrated systems. Some of them are sort of pairs and partners with other bits of ecosystems. So you have things like ShockGrid and RV, which pair up to do some of the aspects of an integrated review system. Most recently, Foundry has announced that that Hero Player is now available, widely available alongside Nuke, and so there's other review system workflows that could be developed or integrated in that. But all of these things are sort of parts of the puzzle and not the entire solution. So a big question for us is, what do we do about that, and what problems are we trying to solve? First problem is that there's really no standards that exist for how media or metadata should be encoded to make sure that everybody's looking at all the same stuff, and has all the context about all the images that they might need in order to make an important decision. So we'd like to provide a paved path for encoding media and metadata to ensure that all this information is consistent and shareable, not just within a particular studio working environment, potentially even between studios and between partners and studios, so that a more rich environment exists for the exchange of media and context, making theoretically and hopefully making better decision making possible between vendors, between clients and vendors, and even internally inside studios making content. And the second big initiative is the fact that no real open source review system exists. And I use the word system specifically here because there are several open source players that are quite competent, and that were even listed in that slide above, that do a good job of presenting frames and allowing people to view and manipulate them accordingly to the way that we like to look at images in these businesses. But no real sort of singular system that puts together all of those pieces of context and metadata exists in order to facilitate a really rich and engaging review ecosystem that would provide all the context necessary to make great decisions. So we're proposing a collaboratively developed open source modular component system, which would provide a platform for developers to customize a review experience. And so that's what our two speakers are going to be talking about today. Oops, these things going a little fast. So our two speakers today are Sam Richards from Walt Disney Imagineering. Sam will be starting off this conversation speaking about media and metadata, and followed by Catalongo Leon. Catalongo is from Sony Pictures Imageworks and will be speaking about a proposal around an open source media review platform. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Sam to kick off the conversation on media and metadata standards.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. As Eric said, I'm going to talk about media and metadata. In particular, it's really talking about how do we improve the review cycle. And by that, I mean, like, the artists submitting work for review, the supervisor in a nice controlled review environment, doing notes and annotations and giving that back to the artist. The reality is, we're starting to get like reviewers now doing stuff not just in controlled environments, but on the web or on tablets that and not necessarily on the kind of like a customized in-house system. Now we're starting to see good third-party systems out there. How do we make this whole system work better? And I think as Eric mentioned earlier, it's also how do you get it working in the context of not just within a vendor, but vendors working with a production hub where there's got to be a lot of handoff between the different, the vendor submitting something to be reviewed, notes coming back. Those notes that might and annotations that are happening in that production hub might be going into that production hub database. But really, we want all that stuff easily exportable and ingestible into the vendor system, and not having to have everything perfectly line up in terms of everyone using the same system. Oh, and I forgot to, the more important part is that once those annotations come back, they do actually have to make it back to the artist. And I think just to kind of putting it a different way is you're starting to see those third-party tools working really pretty well as the review part of that production hub. But I do feel like garbage in, garbage out is maybe a bit kind of strong, but there is certainly an aspect of the information that's going into those review systems is, I think, could be better. So it's nothing that they're doing wrong, but I think how you're encoding your media and how you're getting that information to those tools could be improved, and that's what we're going to kind of go through today. I'm going to break it down into 3 topics. So how do we improve the actual encoding itself? How do we improve the metadata? So like if I start putting something into that QuickTime file that is going from the vendor to the production hub, what kind of metadata could I put in there that would be useful to help the review? And the third one would be, how do I make the notes go better coming back from the production hub to the vendor? So starting with encoding recommendations. We're doing, with the Academy Software Foundation, we're doing a pretty great job with OIO and OCIO in terms of how do we take that media that the artist is generating and turn it into either Rec 709 or sRGB ready for encoding. But I can speak from experience that sometimes we don't always get the job of actually doing that encoding correct. And I think there's a lot of time where we're doing it. Sorry, oops, we're doing it right for. Often doing it right for a review room. So if you're just reviewing an RV, it's probably going to be fine. RV is going to interpret the QuickTime file a certain way, but when you start adding in web and tablet, you start to get things wrong. And I'll talk about that with this slide. So the first part of that encoding process is the RGB to YUV conversion. And a lot of the times that's where we're already kind of like off the path with we're warping the data, probably getting the gamma wrong. So already what you're getting in is not what you're getting out. That's pretty correctable, but that's not the only part of the problem. And again, that would work very well if you're just viewing an RV, if you at least get the gamma correct. But it turns out there's all these kind of tags in QuickTime file for saying what the color space is, and these are standard ones, nothing that we're actually adding. So could we do a better job of documenting and qualifying, which tools you can use and how you can display that stuff correctly in web browsers, such that the gamma is appropriate for what you're expecting, in terms of what you submitted, so that you get everything hopefully kind of looking correct. FFmpeg is frankly pretty hideous in terms of command line arguments. It really is gibberish to most of us. Most people end up just sort of Googly and hope for the best in terms of what the answers they're getting back are. So we really need to do a better job of you know, good best practices for the VFX industry. And I think it's not just giving like a big long string saying, here you are, you're done. I think we really need to document why we're using certain settings. So if you have to do something slightly different, you're making informed decisions on which ones are important. So we're going to start by just focusing on reviews on web browsers and the more common tools like RV and Hero in terms of color fidelity. I think if we're successful with that, then we'll branch out and probably look at some other apps as well. We also want to define some clear codec recommendations for what do you do if you're trying to submit something for editorial versus like if you're doing maybe reviews for like animation modeling where color isn't critical, because you might be able to get away with slightly smaller files versus like final quality files that maybe you want like extended bit depth or something sort of slightly fancier. With all this stuff, this is still very early days. We're definitely looking for feedback on whether these 3 scenarios are enough or whether we should be adding other ones. And also, if you've got experience with FFmpeg in particular, we definitely are looking to add to the group that's certainly giving me advice on the right way of doing it, and which is really useful. So in terms of the metadata, so like a good example of kind of metadata is like you start off like the artist is creating a bunch of files, and usually the vendor, when you're submitting it to be reviewed, you're ending up with the vendor database having some kind of review ID. So both of those are good bits of metadata that in an ideal world we're attaching to that file. Once you get that file to the production hub, and the production hub's also adding their review ID, that we're ending up with all of this information as searchable text fields that the production database can actually use. And one obvious example of where that's particularly useful is how to, when you're sending the notes back, can we attach that vendor review ID to those notes so it's again easily ingestible into the vendor database. Another really good example is like the frame range. I mean, like I start off with say an EXR frame range, and then as soon as it turns into a QuickTime, my start frame is just completely gone. Is there a more sensible like recommendation for how we do this, whether we're using timecode or we're just using auxiliary fields to store what that start frame is? You could be storing this in Slate, and we could be doing this with burn-ins as well. Both of those are valid solutions in some cases, but that still means that now is only embedded in the picture. You can't use that stuff anywhere in the kind of workflow. And also the Slate thing is particularly like Shotgun can do a great job if it knows already that an image sequence that is ingested has a Slate frame. But if you're if a vendor is sending media to a production hub, you've got really no way of knowing whether this QuickTime that's coming in has a Slate or not. So if we could add that as a tag so that Shotgun can do an intelligent job of deciding not to choose the first frame, but choose the second frame, I think that will help eliminate this kind of craziness where all I'm seeing is a Slate frame. So we're looking to use Adobe XMP to store that metadata into QuickTime files. I'm not necessarily totally wedded to just QuickTime files. I mean, there may be scenarios where MXF might make sense. So again, we're looking for advice for that type of thing. And I don't think this is a long list of metadata fields. It probably is like a handful, maybe a dozen kind of metadata fields we're really talking about here. But it would definitely be great to get kind of advice on what kind of things, especially if you're in a production hub, what kind of metadata did you wish you would have from the vendor or not? So lastly, just talking about sharing notes. So it's super common to have like a manifest file when you're sending stuff from the vendors to the production hub. The VES transfer spec has an example of the manifest file, and that's, you know, could easily be stored in an Excel file. So that's well defined. I think the thing that's not well defined is how do those notes come back, and even in particular, like how do we store annotations well? Is something we really need to dig into. For annotations, we're looking at 4 types. There's basic vector shapes, there's sort of pen base with no thickness, sort of a pressure sensitive pen, and possibly going as far as complex brushstrokes, although I think those first 3 are really all we're going to focus on. And in terms of implementation, we definitely want to be looking at something which is where we've got a device independent coordinate space, and everything is defined as vectors, making it fairly lightweight, but also scalable. And we want to be, you know, definitely, you know, with all that other metadata that we've stored, you know, we should be able to have a pretty clear idea of what the real frame number is. So let's store the annotations with the real frame number. But let's also look at storing it with a timestamp. When was the annotation made? If you want to start lining it up to other audio, you at least would have a way of doing that. And we need to make sure that like that resulting render is achievable on both web browsers as well as applications. We're exploring using an existing project called Open Annotation IO as a solution for notes. We don't really have a clear solution for annotations yet, but that's definitely still very early days on that. We're definitely looking for feedback on you know, what other types of data you would really like to get back as a vendor, you know, and definitely anything in particular about annotations that you feel is important. And I think I've just missed a slide. So there should be 2 more slides there, but maybe I'll skip them. There's a group of people, we might actually see the slides later, particularly like Alex, Kevin, have been incredibly helpful in this process. Yeah, hopefully we'll see the slides later in terms of other feedback I'd like to get you along with a mailing list. And I think I'm going to hand over to Codalongo.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Hello, everyone. I'm here to talk about collaborative review tool. So standards are great, definitely a useful thing to do, but you know, through Academy Software Foundation, hopefully we'll also create a software in this space, a tool that potentially people can all use. So as part of the working group, what we did initially was just look at the existing software, both commercial and proprietary systems and open source tools, and just to see where people are, what kind of tools are out there, what things are available for someone to use. So what we found was there's a mixture of different tools available, and there's a huge overlap in what they do, right? Which basically meant, like, especially those companies which went on creating on their own, they were all pretty much reinventing the same wheel. And you know, I come from ImageWorks, and we had our proprietary system that goes all the way to like 25 years. And those systems are showing their age. And we are in a point where we're thinking of like doing a major refactor or rewrite. And we find that like a lot of other people are in the same situation, which means like we're about to reinvent the wheel again. And many of these proprietary systems are not available for free as a complete. There's a lot of open source player available, but not as a complete review system that integrates with all the different components that's needed in a as a review playback system. So when we did this study and we tried to understand like what goes into making such a tool, and in my mind, I kind of like divided into 2 different parts, visible and invisible parts. So what do we mean by visible parts, right? Things like UI and UX that deals with the look and feel of the application, right? So the buttons, menus, keyboard shortcuts, everything that the end user sees. And so here is where like people have lots of opinions on how it should look like, how it should work. And for systems like the ItView software that we use at ImageWorks, there's a lot of muscle memory. People have been using it for like sometimes 20 years, and it's very hard to change. But there is this other component of these tools, which is just invisible, that's working behind the scenes. And for things like, for example, things like IO layer that deals with how do you get the media from network or from files. There's a whole database layer that talks to all the different databases that we have for production tracking and editorial information and whatnot. And there is, obviously a video audio playback engine that just deals with how to make the best use of the hardware resources and make sure that your video and audio go at the given frame rate. There's a big module about annotations. How do you get feedback from creative leadership to the artist? Whole module about color pipeline. How do you make sure that when people see the pixels on their devices, it mimics as much as possible what the audience will see eventually. And if your review system is such that people can all come together in a kind of collaborative system, look at things in real time, there may be like a sync server, like a centralized server that's involved that coordinates all the activities. And there may be a plugin system that lets people like extend what's available as a core software and then create custom workflows. So when it comes to these invisible parts, there's really like not a whole lot of user opinions. Like people just don't really care. They just want people to it to work. As a developer, you might have a lot of opinions. You might have a lot of opinions about how it should be implemented, what technology to use, and all that. As an end user artist, they don't care. These modules can also be defined with a very clear API. What should be the input, how it should behave, what should be the output. And once these APIs are defined, we could have multiple implementation, right? As long as they all do exactly what they're supposed to do, it's easy to put them together. And we can have different implementation based on different operating systems or platforms so that it becomes easy to take individual modules and then port it to other systems. And good news is some parts are already available as open source and even supported by Academia Software Foundation, things like OpenColor.io, OpenImage.io, and OpenTileman.io. They're already available and quite mature and already being used by a lot of these open source and proprietary systems. But obviously there are some big ones missing, right? So the thought is, what if, groups or companies open source either existing software that might fill these missing modules. For example, let's say somebody open sources a playback engine, things that have been developed and that works across multiple platforms and they are really happy with it and it can be easily split out and then made it as an open source module that other companies can use. There could be something that deals with annotations, right? So if we have such a module, it can be open sourced. Or there could be places where there's just no projects available. And we just, as a group, we start working on it together with the purpose of everyone using in a customized way. When it comes to database integration, this is where it can get tricky. A lot of companies have their own proprietary systems. It can be very hard to come up with an API that works with all of them. But already there is some kind of standard, things like Shotgun and F-Track and other systems have become kind of standard, right? So if we have like API even supports those systems, then it can go a long way in supporting a widely usable open source system. So, but what about the visible parts, right? So this is where individual companies can contribute. So the idea is to come up with this very top layer on the end, which puts all these things together, right? And then you create this UI at the top. So the whole benefit of doing that is it takes away all the opinions and arguments about what this UI should look like. It doesn't really matter. If you have an existing proprietary system, this new system can completely mimic it if it wants to. For example, like, in our case, HeatView, we could create an HeatView skin that mimics exactly how the current HeatView works. So for people, it looks like same as the current HeatView, but it could be completely based on new code inside. And each company can create their own skin if they want to, right? So, or they can use some existing ones. And even within a company, there can be multiple skins. We see that in our own company, where like different departments want slightly different workflows based on what they do on a daily basis. And there can be referenced implementation. So we don't have to create a skin if you don't want to, right? There can be popular ones that people can just choose from out of the box. So is this some kind of crazy new idea? Definitely not. This is a very common pattern in software development, especially in open source software development. An example is a WordPress theme. Plenty of internet sites, they all look very different to the end user, but if you look at it closely, they all run on WordPress. 99% of the code is exactly the same, but there is a very thin layer on top. So with a little bit of PHP and CSS, it can be completely customized and give a very different experience to the users. Another example is our Linux itself that many of us use on a daily basis. It's based on a lot of open source modules that just work together very well. And at the end of the day, give completely different custom user interface. Coming a little bit closely to our industry. So we have, for example, open source renderers or commercial renderers. So if you were to write a renderer from scratch today, you don't have to. There's all these different modules available that makes a lot of that job easy. So you just put them together and then you put your additional logic on top of it. So how would an open source review tool look like, right? So it could have these modules. So there could be a playback engine based on OpenGL or Vulkan. There can be an IO layer based on OpenImageIO or FFmpeg. A database layer that uses things like OpenTimeline.io or Shotgun API. Annotations, we don't really have a standard currently, as Sam mentioned, but we could put that in, for example, things like OpenTimeline.io or USD. Color, there's a clear standard already, so with OpenColor.io. So Sync Server, again, we don't have a good solution right now, but is an example. Edbot is a system that it uses internally to coordinate all the different client it views. So we could create something like that that everybody can use. So beyond review tool, right? So just not a standalone tool that people can use. The potential benefit of having an open source module like that would be that different DCCs can integrate within themselves. So when artists move from different DCCs, they would have like a uniform workflow that works across all the DCCs. It could even go beyond DCCs, all the DA systems, non-linear editor systems and things like that. And it can go even beyond our industry for outside of VFX animation. So this is something that we are actively talking about in the Academy Software Foundation Working Group. So if you are interested, please join the conversation, join our working group, and we can take it further. Thank you.
Oh, that's my last slide. Jeff, I missed.
Yes, and thanks to all these people.
Thank you. Yes.
Why don't you actually leave this slide up here with the email address on it, Sam, for now. And I wanted to take what time we had left here for questions. If there are any from the audience, please add them in the chat and I will read them aloud and we can respond. Otherwise, you're all so riveted and fascinated by the content. You've walked away mesmerized, and now I have to go process. Thank you, Josh. Now I feel like a Twitch streamer where I'm like thanking people in the comment chats. But yes, thanks. This is definitely a group effort. There are many folks who have been contributing to this who've been sharing the conversation with us in this working group. we have a question from Sumitra. And yes, these slides will actually be on our YouTube channel coming up tomorrow, so you'll be able to actually watch the whole session. So question from Sumitra. More and more studios seem to be storing media on the cloud off premises. It would seem that a new forward-facing playback engine should be written using modern web playback techniques such as streaming, buffering, etc. in mind. Is that something that's being explored as part of this? Catalongo, do you want to grab that one?
Sure, that's definitely a important consideration, right? Yeah, so it's a definite need for us. And yes, as we move towards cloud, how do you make a playback engine that not only works within our Linux environment, but also on web and also on other devices and basically everywhere, right? So that's another important reason why we're looking to go for a new system.
And we have one more question from Sirman Spiller. How far away are we from open standards for annotations with support in major DCCs? That's what you said.
I would say that we haven't really started, but that's certainly a goal that we want to have. And we seem to be getting a lot of interest in that area. I do actually, just separately, I do also wanted to say how much I've appreciated just the whole Academy Software Foundation framework. If you haven't been involved with the Slack channels and the working groups, it's been a pretty rich and great way of collaborating between groups. There's a lot of collaboration, between like us and OTIO and other teams. It's really been quite an unexpected benefit of the ASWF, at least for me.
Thanks, Sam. I did want to actually echo one comment from Mike Collins that's in the chat and not in the Q&A. Mike is actually asking about a broader conversation around licensing. He says, would anyone agree that a clear license would help spur collaborations? His take is that open source and the free license are fighting for attention, and essentially each have their own agendas for what their purposes are. I can sort of state my own opinion on this, and your mileage may vary, but I think our intent with the foundation, especially with a project like this, where we're talking about a modular system, what we expect people to build on top of, is that our licensing would be appropriately permissive in order to let people do what they need to do with this stuff. I mean, standards are sort of a pretty clear objective. I don't think anyone worries so much about access to that, but in terms of an idea of how would we build a platform or provide a modular system that would then be customizable to the needs of whoever in the community would like to take advantage of either any or all of it. It's our duty to ensure that that's unencumbered by its licensing model in a way that ensures that they can do what they need to and without obligation in ways that would potentially defer or detract or discourage people from contributing. All right, any other questions? If that is it, yeah, no problem, Mike. One more on future plans to accommodate or integrate virtual production and mixed reality workflows.
I can definitely say from my side, one thought particularly with annotations, we shouldn't be just talking about just 2D annotations. The annotations should be including the ability to annotate 3D models or environments. So, it's certainly something that we're thinking about. But if you've definitely got ideas in that area, I definitely welcome your feedback.
And we have one last question from Jay, squeaking it in at the last minute. He was asking whether whether some of the contributors for involving and helping set the standards were companies like Cinesync, FTrack, and SyncSketch. So we have had participation from both the FTrack team and the SyncSketch team. I don't believe we've had Cinesync involved yet. But
welcome.
Yeah, once we get to a place where we've actually got something written down, I'm sure we'll have plenty of excitement and collaboration from folks who are interested in making sure that that's consistent across the board. All right. I think that is our time, and I believe I've got David here to hand off to sort of wrap out the day.